Hello, poodling arounders. First of all, many apologies for not having been with you for a month or two. I've had to take a bit more care of myself of late, but here I am now. And today's podcast is a little insight into what I did in July and where I poodled around then. For someone who studied Italian for so many years, it was absolutely crazy that I'd never been to Rome. But there was a reason, namely my now grown-up son, or sweet child of mine as I like to refer to him, who throughout his teens used to completely refuse, is the only word to put it politely, to go with me to Rome. Then, lo and behold, a few years ago, he suddenly announced he was off to Rome with his mate. To say I was less than impressed was a little bit of an understatement. So he's been in the doghouse, was in the doghouse until summer 2023, when he suddenly presented me with Coldplay tickets for my birthday. And not just any old Coldplay tickets, but ones for their July 2024 concert in Rome. So finally, I was heading to the Eternal City. Now, I am a bit of a romantic, I have to say, and I had all these iconic images in my head when I thought about Rome. So number one was the Federico Fellini black and white iconic film La Dolce Vita with Anita Ekberg and Marcello Mastroianni, who, shall we say, had a moment in the middle of the Trevi Fountain. Is that the best way to put it? Number two was Audrey Hepburn on a Vespa in Roman Holiday. So this was all a bit pressurised. Was it all going to be one big disappointment for me? Well, we shall find out about that. But I hope that what I tell you will also provide you with some really great tips so that if you want to follow in my footsteps and visit Rome, you can avoid some of the things that I did wrong and perhaps follow the tips to get things right. So let's start with the flight, shall we? I flew in from Stansted rather than my closest airport of Manchester because it proved to be a lot cheaper. I also really like Stansted as an airport. I think the facilities are much better. I think the car parking arrangements are really good. So what I would say is do check out the price of flights to Rome if you're considering going, and don't necessarily head from the obvious airport because there was a considerable difference in the cost of the flight. Of course, you might not be flying from the UK, and this is where things get a little bit tricky because there are two airports serving Rome. So the budget airline and the Ryanairs of this life tend to use the airport at which I landed, which is Ciampino. But non-budget airlines and international operators will typically use the other airport of Fiumicino. Now, that might not seem that complicated, but let me tell you, I was completely barged out of the way at the check-in desk, literally whilst handing over my passport, by a man who was actually Italian, which is even more unfathomable, who had arrived at the wrong airport for his flight and was in an absolute panic, wondering how on earth he was going to get to the other airport. So when you realise that can happen, you can sort of see it can be a big deal. Now, Ciampino is pretty small. If you land there, the key thing to know is that there is no metro or train service to get you into the city, and you're going to be finding yourself around 20 kilometres outside of Rome. So the thing that might have encouraged you, if you've done a bit of homework prior to your arrival, is that taxis charge a fixed rate from Ciampino to the city. And in summer 2024, that fixed rate was €30. But what's really going to soon deflate you, if you stand at the taxi rank to the right of the airport building as you exit it, is that taxis seldom arrive at the rank. Admittedly, this was a Sunday when I arrived, but it seems a pretty common situation. So if you're used to a situation like that, a UK transport hub, where a taxi arrives at the rank as soon as one departs, you're going to be very disappointed. The next cab off the rank at Ciampino can arrive in 20 minutes, and that's if you're really, really lucky. So let's just bring the temperature in Rome in July into this equation, because I'd been absolutely dreading this following the heat wave the previous summer, because I don't know if you recall, there was talk of tourists being confined to their hotel room, having to stay indoors, putting restrictions on tourists around the main tourist sites because people were just collapsing in the heat. Now, I'd been monitoring this really, really carefully, I have to say, and prior to departure, things weren't too bad. But unfortunately, a few days before we left, the thermometer was hitting 27 and 28 Celsius every day. There is some shade by the Ciampino taxi rank, but not an awful lot, and I was immediately reaching for the Factor 50 sunscreen within about 10 minutes of standing there. Now, after about probably 45 minutes of listening to what appears to be some sort of bird scarer that's situated right by the taxi rank, and having seen just 2 taxis in all of that time, we kind of realised that other strategies were required here. So here you need to take a bit of a gamble, and it is a gamble. You can either walk diagonally from the taxi rank across the airport's forecourt, shall we call it, and try to get a bus. The queues there are pretty long, however, as well. And if you go for that option and leave the taxi queue, you need to be sure that there is going to be a bus, and B, that you can actually get on board that bus. Or you can try to get a private taxi via an app, book it, and ask it to come and collect you. Now, having the app facility for a taxi is pretty essential in Rome because there just are not enough taxis to go around, even at present. And I say that because next year it's going to be the Jubileo, a big celebration in the Catholic Church, and 30 million tourists are expected to descend on Rome just for that. I mean, I absolutely hate to think how long the taxi queue at the airport is going to be. Uber is not a big thing in Italy. And if you use Uber in Rome, it's going to be an Uber Black service at best. What you need is another app that's going to allow you to access some sort of taxi service. So you could get something like the Free Now app, the IT Taxi app, We Taxi, or App Taxi. Probably try to get a few of those. But do take my advice, from experience. Do not leave the taxi rank at Ciampino until you are absolutely 100% certain that the driver you've called on your app is not going to cancel the booking on you. I did that, and it was absolutely soul destroying to then have to go back to the end of the queue, having left it, and start the whole process over again. Now, you're probably going to need quite a lot of cash for taxis in general in Rome, so don't leave home without any cash. A pre-charged credit card is great, but not everybody will accept that. And if you want to use taxi services, it's a case of beggars can't be choosers. You really need to grab a cab wherever the opportunity presents itself, and you can't always rely on prepayment online. So let's go back to the heat. Absolutely nothing can prepare you for how hot Rome can be in a heat wave. Although I did get a pretty good idea when an American woman dashed into the hotel lift with me, looked as though she was about to expire on the spot, and explained she'd just done the Colosseum tour and really couldn't take any more. And this was just about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, at which point I thought, there's a lesson here to be learnt somehow. And that's pretty much how it is, because if you're sensible and you find yourself in Rome in this sort of heat, you will head out as early as possible before the mercury rises, and you will book any pre-booked visits for the top attractions for that time. And this is one reason, really, why taxis can be so important, as walking around in that heat can really be an ask too far. Now, having sort of read all the horror stories from the year before, I did go really well prepared. I bought this slightly ridiculous sun hat with a really large brim, and it also incorporates a flap that goes back over the shoulders. It looks like I'm in the middle of the Sahara Desert, I have to say, but, it does the trick. I also bought a special sun umbrella, which has deflectors to get rid of the UV rays. And I took both a portable and a battery-operated fan. Now, I did probably look ridiculous in the less than flattering hat, but it was a lifesaver. The sun umbrella definitely came into its own, even though I was told it made me look like a tour guide and I'd probably get a heap of people following me around. And the fan definitely revived me whenever I lost the will to live. Now, you will find plenty of street traders selling hats and fans wherever you look, but these will come at a price, so pack one yourself. I can honestly say I have never seen so many handheld fans in use, And I was really surprised just how many men were using them as well. And I think that probably tells you just how hot it is. Obviously, drink lots of water too, and do head to the shade whenever you can. If a restaurant says it's got air conditioning, do check that they turn it on. It's not always the case. Now, whilst we're talking about health issues, let's talk mosquitoes. On arrival at Ciampino, there was a massive billboard of a mosquito sitting there in the middle of the arrivals hall with a warning of dengue fever and how it could be spread by mosquitoes. Now, dengue might be something that we associate with the African subcontinent, but it is becoming more of an issue in Europe due to climate change. And Brits don't typically have a means of being vaccinated against it unless they've already suffered dengue. So that means having to be really extra cautious about mosquito bites. Now, because I write blogs for a travel insurer, I'm writing about this all of the time in my PR job. So I did take my own advice for once, and I went armed with a DEET-based mosquito repellent. That's DEET. And that is what is the recommended mosquito repellent, one that is supposed to have the most efficacy if you're trying to fend off those mozzies. Now, I do find that spray-on repellents can leave you feeling extremely wet. So I wanted to avoid that really. So I took a fairly easy to carry roll-on version of the DEET mosquito repellent. And that was really handy because literally I was dabbing that on when out and about. I also packed long linen trousers for the evenings and long sleeve shirts to cover up the arms by evening too. Because after all, that's when mosquitoes bite, isn't it? Well, let's get on to that. Having a room with air conditioning was a must for me, both for the heat situation and the mosquito deterrent requirement, and that worked well. The room proved to be mosquito free. And in fact, my whole strategy was great until the morning of my departure, when, cleverly, Jane decided that a few hours without repellent wouldn't really do any harm, because it might be a bit smelly on the plane. And I didn't really want to have it on with the clothes I was going to fly in. But how wrong I was, because on the only day that I didn't apply any repellent, and really only being out and about between about 10 a.m. and 12, I was bitten around 7 times right down my arm with pretty massive bites by a seemingly very hungry mozzie. And this brings me neatly back to dengue, as the mosquito that spreads dengue bites by day and not by night. And I knew that beforehand, so how stupid and over-trusting am I? Luckily, I didn't suffer any ill effects other than the bites. So what about accommodation? Well, I stayed in an absolutely brilliant hotel called Hotel Napoleon, which was originally built inside a 19th century palace, and it's located in Piazza Vittorio Emanuele II. It's 4-star, it's not that expensive at all. The rooms are sufficiently nice and they're air conditioned, as I said, but there's a sort of heritage charm and a timeless elegance to the place, plus lots of antique furnishings dotted around. To get to your room, you have to cross a marbled lounge area before getting into a fairly small and somewhat rickety-looking lift, of yesteryear, but that's all part and parcel of the vibe here. Breakfast is self-serve and there is so much choice, even bacon for us Brits, but I could neither understand the presence of nor stomach the thought of cooked carrots and veg that was also available. Now, the number one best thing about this hotel, absolutely categorically, without a shadow of a doubt, are the reception staff. Particularly one man. When I was checking in, he asked my name, and to make it easy, I spelt it out for him in Italian. Whilst most people in the world would then just continue to converse with me in English, he actually did the courtesy of speaking to me in Italian throughout the rest of the check-in process, explaining the route to this rickety lift and how to cross the lounge to get to it. And I just thought that was super impressive. And he continued to be super impressive, and his colleagues did throughout my stay. They're just so helpful with advice, booking taxis, taking care of luggage. And I did note that behind the reception desk, there are a variety of TripAdvisor certificates on display, and they all talk about the reception team and how good they are. Now, prior to booking this hotel online, done a bit of research, obviously, checked out TripAdvisor, etc., etc., and there were a few warnings about the area around the hotel because there is a large park opposite, and it was suggested that this contributes to theft issues. It also talked about there being some vagrancy around. And I would say that there's a sheltered arcade walkway outside the hotel. And on the last morning, I was approached by a beggar, but this was pretty rare. But like anywhere, just be more cautious by night because it did seem a little more edgy by night than by day. But where isn't it like that? The great part is there's a really super handy cafe come eatery right next door to the hotel. And, that was super helpful in this heat because going back to the hotel about 2 in the afternoon after about 5 or 6 hours out, and then having a bit of recovery time, but then knowing that there was somewhere to go to really close at hand just for a bite to eat, that was fantastic having that next door. The park itself is really quite pleasant to head to by day. Probably wouldn't do it in the darkness, but it's greenery right in the heart of Rome. And there's also an ice cream stall right opposite the hotel. So, what more could you want, really? Well, the answer to that is probably a metro station. And luckily, there is a metro station literally just a few meters from the hotel door. And this is Vittorio Emanuele station. It's literally that close. It's on line A of the metro, and it just makes things super handy. You literally step out of the hotel door, go down the steps, and you're in the station. But what can you see and do in Rome? Well, to be honest, my number one must see was the Trevi Fountain. As I said to you, just a fan of La Dolce Vita and all that iconic cinematography. So if you want to see the Trevi Fountain, just bob down into the metro station, buy a ticket at the machine, and hop on board a train. And you can very quickly get to Barberini, which is very close to the Trevi. An alternative at other times would have been Spagna Station, but it was closed for upgrade works during my visit. And I saw quite a few closures of different metro stations because there seems to be a lot of restoration work going on. And there is a massive project to actually put in a new line and new stations, which is quite exciting actually, because I suddenly thought to myself, oh my goodness, what will they find when they start excavating for this new line? And then I saw these billboards that pointed out that they were finding thousands and thousands of Roman treasures. And what they're actually going to do is put these on display within the tube stations. Anyway, back to Barberini. When you exit Barberini, literally follow the crowds if you want to know which way the Trevi Fountain is, or look out for signs on walls that will point you towards the fountain. And you find it at the meeting point of the Tre Vie that give it its name, 3 streets that all converge in the piazza. Now, the streets closest to it are largely traffic-free. You might get the odd car going up and down to deliver something, but they're full of shops selling souvenirs, jewellery, trinkets, wonderful limoncello of all varieties, really, Italian toys, and a variety of local foodstuffs. So there's plenty of formaggi on sale. There's plenty of cold meats as well. There's lots and lots to attract the attention. While the limoncello is really lovely and you will be offered a sample of it, try to resist buying it because you will find it is considerably cheaper in the duty free at the airport. Now, heading down to the Trevi Fountain is actually quite joyous and there's lots of vibrancy all around it. But I have to say, I arrived and thought, oh, it's not as big as I thought it was. But despite that, size isn't everything. And it is stunning. I just imagined it bigger. So it's stunning if you can get close enough through the hundreds of human ants that are running all over the steps that surround its glorious Baroque magnificence, I would say. And here you're going to quickly recognise that one of the chief bugbears of modern life in any big tourism spot like Rome is the selfie seeker. So, gone are the days when a family member would take a quick pic of you and let someone else enjoy the viewpoint by standing aside. You can literally wait a good 5 or 10 minutes, even longer if you've run into a true narcissist, before the perfect selfie has been secured. But we're in the 21st century and it's the way it is. But in the middle of a heat wave, it's probably even more irksome to have someone stand there and do all their selfie taking while you're absolutely roasting and waiting for that chance to get a quick snap of Oceanus and his aquatic cohorts. What irked me more, perhaps, though, is that the romantic notion of people heading to the Trevi to throw a coin over their shoulder and make a wish seems to have been more or less eroded by the selfie behaviour. I mean, what's going on in the world? Tradition is being washed away by a look at me culture. In fact, I only witnessed one other person throwing a coin in and perhaps recalling the lyrics to the Three Coins in a Fountain tune like I was. Now, I won't say what I wished with my coin, but it's the same as I wished in Bremen, if you want to refer to that podcast, although I didn't tell you then either. One day, perhaps the dream will come true, despite the improbability. Anyway, I thought I was doing swimmingly in day one of the heat when I was at the Trevi. I was minus the hat at this point, thinking, oh, this isn't too bad at all. And then I headed into the far right corner where there's a water fountain. And at that point, dizziness just hit me like a brick. And I knew it was time to look stupid, put on the silly hat, and get some shade on the head. Now, I cannot tell you how tempting it is to just jump into the fountain or even dangle a toe or a hand in. But do not do that. This is something I'm always writing about as well in my blogs. Fines for entering the water are really heavy in Rome, around €500. And it's also not permitted to eat anything around a public place like this. So don't picnic by a fountain either. In fact, I'm pretty sure that sitting on the side of the fountain is also technically banned. But Rome's prisons would probably be so full of selfie seekers if that was enforced that they probably don't bother to do that. So what really lifted the spirits at this point, feeling a bit faint, dizzy, fed up with selfie seekers, was that I spotted a billboard that really conveyed a bit of Irish humour. Reading, "Forget the Trevi, have a bevy." How enterprising is that nearby Irish pub? Good on that person who came up with that. Now, something not to be missed on the road Via del Lavatore that leads away from the Trevi Fountain in the direction of the shops is the absolutely amazing gelateria called Valentino. I actually went back there and to the Trevi on my last day because the gelato, or ice cream Italian style if you like, was just so amazing. There are a couple of benches outside and there's a bit of seating inside. So try to grab one of those seats to truly appreciate the delights. And I say that because if you imagine how hot it is, your ice cream melts really quickly if you're stuck outside in the sun. I went for a €5.50 tub with a mixture of sugar-free lampone, raspberry, amarena, cherry, and frutti di bosco, fruits of the forest. And it was delicious, I have to say. Far nicer than the gelato from the stall opposite the hotel, and a world better than English ice cream. I can't say that I fared as well with my dinner choices. I hadn't realised on entry into a restaurant that's really pretty close to the Trevi that it was actually serving Tuscan cuisine. And now, having been through this, I note that there is a fair bit of Tuscan cuisine to be had in Rome eateries, and it's not all the traditional cacio e pepe pasta that you might think it's going to be. So the eatery in question was Il Chianti, which really attracted because of the mention of air conditioning more than anything else. And inside there was a big fan going round, but no evidence of aircon in operation. And even the fan was shut off at one point, but never mind. The staff were very friendly, and the starter of Parma ham and melon was huge, absolutely huge, and sufficient to be a main course in its own right. That was problem number one, really, because there probably wasn't a lot of room left after having had this mountain of melon. And I then came very unstuck with thinking that I was back in Bologna, and I ordered pasta with ragu, which is one of my absolute favourites in Bologna. But I found to my horror that it was served with something very heavy that I now have a strong suspicion was minced wild boar. And I literally took a few mouthfuls, couldn't eat anymore and even refused the offer to take the rest home because I really didn't want it. So wild boar, if you haven't had it, is an acquired taste, I would say. It is very heavy. It's just not to my liking. So the moral of the tale really is check how large your starters are going to be and whether you need anything else. If you order one of the many pizzas to be had in Rome, of course, that's not going to be an issue. Unless you've enjoyed the little treat that comes with a glorious aperitif, such as my very favourite Aperol Spritz. These were taralli, a round, crispy, unleavened cracker treat that originally comes from Puglia, and it has a hole in the middle, so it looks a little bit like a coin, and they're absolutely Moorish. But don't overdo it, or there's going to be no room for anything else in that tummy. Now, a must-do in Rome is naturally the Colosseum. And here, I would say that things are super organised, in Italian terms at least, as you can book your ticket online and entry is at a specific time. So all that problem of overcrowding doesn't really exist because everybody knows what time they've got to be in there. Having said that, you must remember to take your passport with you as it will be checked against your ticket as validation. And you need to find where to enter the Colosseum when you get there. With thousands of people milling around, despite the controlled entry time, that can be difficult. Now, the metro station for the Colosseum is Colosseo, very handy, and it's also pretty close. But if you head straight there, you will miss out on the delights that are strewn along the road that lead up to the Colosseum. And I would suggest that before you, if you're travelling independently at least, before you go to the Colosseum, you start your journey there in Piazza Venezia, which is probably 10 minutes walk away at the most. If you do that in the early morning, bearing in mind the heat, it's not going to be too bad. And as the piazza itself has glorious buildings with Roman architecture, it's located at the base of the Capitoline Hill. And from there, you can walk back down a really wide street and you will go past the Roman Forum with all of its impressive ruins that you'd be looking down on at that point. In there, you've got the Temple of Saturn and the Arch of Titus. I mean, there are so many columns and arches, all in that kind of Roman hue that will just make your photos look brilliant and really bring to life, I think, the story of what you're going to discover in the Colosseum. As you are pretty close to the Colosseum, you'll find a street to the left, which has lovely street cafes, which thankfully have some tables in the shade as well. Now, once you get through the ticket barrier and have shown your online pass and get inside the Colosseum, you'll need to follow the flow and move around the amphitheatre, taking in the atmosphere, imagining the gladiators, Russell Crowe, if you like. But there is a definite kind of way you have to move around, and that will be guided as you go. There's a massive crucifix at the starting point of your journey as you enter the amphitheatre. And that can serve as a really good reference as to where you are inside the enormous structure because it's vast. So you're going in this circular direction, and that can really give it's like your true north, that crucifix. You know that's where you entered the building. Now, tour groups may well be found hogging a few areas where the best views can be found. So you need to have some patience. And my sun umbrella certainly saved the day here because of that, that very problem that you are standing around waiting for people to move so that you can see what's going on too. But also, if you head out under some of the arches on the outer wall, you might just find, as I did, a very welcome breeze blowing there. And that's a quick natural freshen up. It's also shaded, but that breeze can be a lifesaver. Don't be confused at the Colosseum as to why you can't get into the gift shop at one point. It's not very clear, but if you try to get in that way, you will actually end up in the vast melee of people coming out because it's actually the exit. And this is all part of the one-way system that you're going to encounter at times. So the entry point to the shop is actually somewhere else entirely, although it isn't really pointed out to you that that's the case. Now, the Colosseum is really photogenic, and all in all, thanks to the sensible ticketing arrangement, it's not unbearably overcrowded. So I would definitely put that on your must-visit list. Now, the same, unfortunately, cannot be said of the Vatican experience, but that's being a bit unfair, so let me break this down. Now, Ottaviano is the nearest metro station, accessible by taking the metro to Termini and changing line there. Now, word of caution, first of all. Termini is the main train station in Rome, and it is vast. The constant tannoy announcements about pickpockets and thieves are done for a reason. Now, I'd safeguarded myself, again, because of my blog writing, as much as possible against theft by taking a hidden money device, which was very, very handy as it's strapped to my bra, and also a crossbody bag that's slash proof and also has zips that can lock. Now, it seems that my anti-theft measures were well worth it. Though a really kind local woman urged us to be careful at Termini and protect our belongings. So she was obviously concerned, could tell we were tourists and thought we might be robbed. So be warned, it happens. Now, when you arrive at the tube station by the Vatican, Ottaviano, people will descend on you. You basically have two choices at that point, and they are trying to sway your choice as to what to do. So your two choices are head to St. Peter's or San Pietro and the main square by the Vatican, or go to the Vatican museums and see the Sistine Chapel. Now, the people who are descending on you are basically selling salta coda options, jump the queue options, basically. Whether or not they are all legit is debatable because you have no idea of assessing whether the person that you're dealing with is actually registered or authorized in any way or not. On being offered a ticket for €80 to jump the queue into the Vatican Museum and being told that I could go straight into St. Peter's thereafter if I did that, I declined with well, I'm not paying £80, only to be told, well, it's not pounds, it's euros. But even doing the maths on the exchange rate didn't make that much difference. I still wasn't going to pay £67 to jump a queue. So I was told, you'll be in a queue as long as the distance from London to Rome, but I still didn't budge on my decision. And in any case, I wanted to do St. Peter's first. And on arrival in the square, the queue looked pretty long. I mean, to be honest, it was snaking right round the square. But the good part was there was some shade and it proved to move very, very quickly. What the main issue was, which I'm still quite mad about, to be honest, was that we appeared to have been the only people to have abided by the dress code. So I was wearing long trousers, had a shirt covering my arms, and was well remembering that I had once been refused entry to Milan Cathedral for having bare shoulders. So, having arrived at the height of the Catholic Church and thinking that the rules there would be stricter than anywhere else in the world, I couldn't believe that there was no control over the dress code. And ridiculously, I saw one poor woman pulled out of the queue and made to put on a skirt that she was loaned, and the hundreds of others who entered with no action taken was just incredible. Of course, in 25-degree heat, even by that time of day, it makes it even worse that you've abided by the rules and are covered from head to toe. But luckily, the queue moved quickly and we got inside St. Peter's fairly efficiently, and it was cool. Now, I have to say, I'm not usually a fan of churches and cathedrals at all, but I found St. Peter's absolutely beautiful. And for once in a church, there was no ban on photography. It was fairly easy to maneuver around. There were big tour groups in there, but there's a lot of space. And you could basically go in whichever direction you wanted, which helped. And it was a really pleasant start to the day, which was then augmented by taking pictures outside in the piazza of the fountains and imagining the Pope in situ addressing the throngs out there. Having done all of that, it was time to walk back to the point where my ticket-selling pest had been in evidence, and I was dreading bumping into him again, to be honest. Uh, when you get to that point, you have to turn left and sort of walk along the wall of the Vatican, and then take another left, which is where the queue into the Vatican museums is. And that is on a really, really quite long road. And you have no idea what's going on because you turn that corner and you virtually, at that point, come slap bang into the queue that's trying to get into the Vatican Museum. But you literally cannot see the start of the queue. And you have no idea whether that queue then goes round the corner where you still can't see any further than that. So it's all kind of like going into this mystery world of, well, how long are we going to actually be in this queue? And there was somebody, I think, who worked for the Vatican Museums advising people and saying, well, from here, it's probably going to be about an hour. At which point we thought, well, okay, we're British, we can queue. It's in the shade where the sun's direction was at that point of the day. So it actually wasn't too bad. And you could actually, there were two options. You could actually lean against the wall, which I did to kind of take some of the pressure off the feet. Or you could be like other people and sit on some railings that kind of divide the pavement in two. But if you bear in mind, this is like 25 degrees, and the number of people I saw sit down for about 2 seconds and then jump up like scalded frogs, I realised that actually leaning against the wall was the best bet. Now, this railing serves a purpose. It's not a great purpose, I have to say, because the purpose of it is that beyond the railing are the people who can jump the queue, because at this point they're paying 60 or 40 euros. The price goes down slightly as you turn the corner, or they're in a tour group. And this is the problem, because it is so difficult to know how fast you're going to get into the Vatican museums. Every 10 minutes or so, about 50 people from those who haven't paid to jump the queue will go in, and you will move up a few yards. And meanwhile, you will be watching people scooting up this other side of the railings and seemingly getting into the Vatican Museum because they've paid to do so. So it is frustrating. This was not, however, although we did spend an hour standing there, it wasn't the worst thing about the Vatican Museum's experience. When you eventually get inside the building, there is, I would say, a marked lack of information about what you're supposed to do next. It's just assumed you know what to do next. And to be frank, every member of staff that we tried to approach to ask for information was just very, very rude. So we fathomed it out with little help from anyone. And the first thing we did was see the Vatican Gardens, which was absolutely lovely. But it was all downhill from there, I would say. So I spotted a sign to the Sistine Chapel. That's really all I wanted to see. And I thought, right, great, let's head off to the Sistine Chapel. And to show willing, just to think, well, I've bought a ticket and there are about 7 or 8 museums in here. I can go into these. So I showed willing and went into the first one. Big mistake. That gallery was extremely long and it took a real while to get around it. But having come out, I thought, never mind. At least I did that. Off to the Sistine Chapel. Now, little did I know that the Vatican Museum is like a much longer, far more draining, and ridiculously infuriating version of IKEA. You simply cannot head to the Sistine Chapel. You literally have to spend hours walking through countless galleries and chapels, along corridors, up and down staircases. I mean, if you've got a wheelchair or a pram, forget it, because you just wouldn't negotiate it. And it's just one long, maddening, one-way journey that leaves you feeling completely trapped. I mean, this is a bit of an admission now. I don't suffer claustrophobia as such, but I do suffer clothes claustrophobia if I get stuck in something that I can't get off. But I was beginning, I think, to feel claustrophobic in this whole experience. There's hardly anywhere to sit and rest, despite the heat. And worse still, there are times when you literally cannot move at all because some inconsiderate tour guide has allowed their group to completely block the way. And throughout this whole long, tortuous journey, this happens constantly. I can honestly say I felt like I was following Dante's journey to hell. So by the time I got to the Sistine Chapel, all these millions of chapels and corridors and staircases later, I couldn't have cared less, to be quite honest. I was literally on the verge of fainting, and I could have died a slow death when we entered the room and realised how crammed it was. So, in all this garb that we'd worn to be compliant with the dress code, none of this was funny. When it then became apparent that all these non compliant people in their skimpy dress were being equally non compliant by taking photos, which you're not allowed to do in the Sistine Chapel, my very non breaking rule son suddenly decided that he was going to do the same, saying, I've absolutely had enough of being the only one who does things properly. But even at that point, feeling that the shine had been taken off the whole thing by the ridiculous access system, there was no escape. Not before another tortuous journey had been taken along never-ending corridors, and then through various gift shops. So the only thing that I can tell you is that the famous route straight to St. Peter's that the ticket tout had kept stressing clearly didn't exist at all. So I did feel vindicated in not forking out for that €80, not pounds, ticket. So my advice to anyone thinking of visiting the Vatican Museum is actually don't do it. Unless you absolutely love art, stick to looking at pictures online. In a heat wave, it's a nightmare, and at other times, I suspect it continues to be an equally draining experience. Unfortunately, this was the same day as the Coldplay concert, so there was very little time to recover before setting off for the Stadio Olimpico. Heading off to the concert, we should have realised a few things. Firstly, the man on reception was the guy who checked me in, and I realised he was a bit of me. And when he heard that we wanted a taxi for Coldplay, he looked at me really questioningly and asked me if that was really my musical taste. I said I truly preferred a bit of Axl Rose and Guns N' Roses, and he nodded knowingly and said, yeah, he thought so. I looked at his bracelets all over his arm and realised he was a bit of a kindred spirit. Anyway, call a taxi he could not, so we had to eventually jump on the metro and travel to Flaminio to try our luck there at that tube station. At that point, we realised we weren't alone when an American couple descended. Now, they'd only flown in that day, they'd lost their baggage, they didn't seem to have a clue how to get around Rome, and just appeared truly helpless. Somehow, against all odds, I more or less stepped in front of a taxi and managed to flag it down. So I offered to share a ride with the American couple, who seemed to have been stranded without really even trying to flag down a taxi for absolutely ages. I think they were grateful, although I think they thought that the €50 that was being asked to get to the stadium was a bit steep. But I think on a concert night, that's the going rate. And after all, they were sharing it, so it wasn't as if they were having to pay the whole €50 themselves. I then conversed with the driver and I asked him about the return journey after the concert. And he said it would definitely be better to wait a while, as taxis can't get through to the stadium, roads are shut by the police, and it's a general nightmare. Having already found online a bar that would stay open 24 hours a day, right by the river, we decided that the best bet would to be go there after the concert for a short while, allow the crowds to dissipate, and then get the taxi home. Words cannot describe how hot it was in the stadium, and I have to say you need to be prepared for a bit of a hike to even get to the stadium and into your seat from the taxi drop-off points. Again, because of the road closures, the police presence, etc. By this time, having already been through the Vatican Museum experience for most of the day, the feet were truly flagging. Now, poor Chris and Coldplay. He kept wafting his clearly drenched T-shirt on stage as best he could, because it must have been absolutely dripping, talking about the crazy heat in Rome. And I just felt for him, because what it must have been to be performing in that heat, I cannot imagine. The crowd went wild for every song. The Stadio Olimpico is a great place for that kind of concert. Everybody had been given a glowing wristband, so it all truly added to the event, and it was an absolutely fantastic spectacle as the stadium lit up. It might not have been my number one choice of music, but it was a great evening out. It was, I say, until the journey home. Now, as I said, we'd planned to go to this bar river, as it's called, this bar by the river. And that all worked very well, with plenty of other people doing the same. We saw buses departing the stadium, absolutely rammed with people, all local people heading back to wherever they lived in Rome. And there were thousands more people milling around. So when we thought it looked like a reasonable time to leave, when the crowds had gone down a bit, we did. And there wasn't a taxi in sight. So we, and I would say thousands of other people still, were walking aimlessly around, all trying to find a taxi, all sort of spreading out along really long roads so that if a taxi came, we all might stand a chance of getting one, all to no avail. We tried teaming up with others in the same boat to share a ride if something came. Nothing did. There was absolutely nothing available on any of the apps, and it got to 1 a.m. and still nothing. So I took the decision that the only thing we could possibly do was to walk back to the hotel, knowing it's 10 kilometres away. So I started doing that, and then I just thought, you know what? You're always writing about don't wander off route, don't go down these back streets, don't walk through neighbourhoods that you don't know. And what are you doing, Jane? You're doing all of that, and you haven't a clue how safe these neighbourhoods are at this time in the morning. So I discovered some men loading a lorry. Not quite sure what they were loading it with, but I spoke to them in Italian and, was really hoping they might say, oh, just jump in, we'll take you back. But no, they suggested we head back to the river where there was a rank. So yes, there was a rank, but there were about 20 people already there. And you guessed it, no taxis to be seen. So by this time, I was virtually in tears. I was absolutely resigned to sleeping right there on the pavement, realizing we were truly stranded. As one of the delivery men had said, all taxi drivers would have gone home at midnight. Somehow, it's not like England, if you're used to that, or Britain, where taxis will operate throughout the night and you will always be able to get someone. It's like clock off time comes, that's it, black and white. So in my hour of desperation, and it was truly desperation, when all seemed truly hopeless, an angel from heaven turned up. He told me his name was Vittorio, but I suspect that was probably because I told him I wanted to go to Vittorio Emanuele Piazza. He said, jump in. We had a good old chinwag. I don't think my son understood a word of what I was talking to him about, but we got a guided tour of Rome by night. Well, at least I did, with my angel describing all the highlights to me. I've never been so grateful in my life for this man. I staggered into the hotel room thinking how desperately I needed a shower. Now it was 2 a.m. in the morning, only to find no water in the room thanks to the plumbing maintenance. So I literally just collapsed on the bed thinking tomorrow's another day. Anyway, my kindred spirit on reception told me that Rome has this major issue with big events because there aren't enough taxi drivers to go around. And if it is ever suggested that there should be more taxi drivers, the existing ones go on strike. So lesson learned, even if you don't get to hear the last song at a concert at the Stadio Olimpico, leave early. Now, one place that I failed to tell you about is where we had lunch after the Colosseum experience. You remember I told you about Termini Station and the theft issues? Well, sort of attached to Termini Station, there's a fantastic place called Mercato Centrale. You basically get to street level in the station and then walk out through a department store in order to reach it. Or you can exit by the station taxi rank and turn left, walk along the street and then enter the market, basically that way. And Mercato Centrale is a food lover's heaven. It's absolutely full of outlets selling food of all types, descriptions, cuisines from all around the world. Whatever you fancy eating, it's probably there. So you simply head to the stall or the stand that you like the look of, you order what it is that you want, and you then eat it in a shared space with everybody else who's done the same. So we walked to the very bottom of the food hall and we found a pizza venue there. It was only actually whilst ordering that my son realised that the pizza was being cooked in Valoriani ovens, actually the ones that I promote here in the UK on behalf of my client Orchard Ovens. So what a small world. You can also get absolutely gloriously delicious, scrumptious cakes from a cake stall by one of the entrance and exit doors to Mercato Centrale. And we did that, and we even managed to get them back to the hotel without them getting squished on the metro. Now, at Hotel Napoleon, there's a very handy convenience store just around the corner. So we could stock up on cold drinks and a few crisps if we didn't want to eat. We could just have a snack. There's a hotel fridge, so both the drinks and the cakes fit in there perfectly until it was time to enjoy them. Now, Mercato Centrale is so good and reasonably priced that we were tempted to go back there on the day after the concert because we headed to Termini again, having booked a train to take us to the coast at Santa Marinella. That meant escaping the hot city centre for the day, seeing something different, seeing kind of where the Romans might go at weekends. Well, not Roman soldiers, obviously. I do mean Roman people today. So we booked our train tickets online, and I discovered that this has a really major advantage because not only can you travel and know that you're going to get on the train, you can escape that tricky thing in Italy of having to validate your ticket by getting it stamped in a machine before you board. With an online reservation, you don't have to do any of that. You just scan your phone at the barriers. Now, Termini Station is vast, so finding the right platform was one thing. However, to be honest, the platform we had to board from, which is a very far right one on this station, was so long that I felt we'd actually walk to the coast before we even got on the train. The train ride itself takes about an hour to 70 minutes, and it costs peanuts, quite honestly, about £4. It stops in a variety of seaside places along the way, so you could choose to go to one of those instead. And I was really surprised that it was absolutely packed on a weekday. Now, we shared the ride with a group of about 10 teenagers, clearly out of school for the summer, and I found it absolutely fascinating as I could understand every word they said, and they didn't have a clue that I could speak Italian. I remember getting off the train and saying to my son, "Wow, that was really fun, wasn't it?" But he hadn't understood a word of what was going on, or how one lad had ended up being a panino or a sandwich in the video game that he'd been playing with a girl who clearly fancied him, even though he was dating the one who'd taken a swig out of the other girl's water bottle without permission and been told she was disgusting. Oh, it was just such fun. On arrival, we walked into the village centre and we had a coffee next to the bookshop at the cafeteria that's called the Cafe of the Authors. And that was really pleasant until I realised that a wild-looking cat that may well have already lost an eye was having some sort of fit very close to my cat-phobic son. I sensed major trouble ahead when it ended up the other side of a motorbike right next to us with my son's eyes firmly glued on it. Unfortunately, when it flew at a very friendly beagle that was passing by, that was the end of our sojourn in the cafe. In fact, I was amazed it had lasted that long from past cat-phobic episodes that we've enjoyed. So we had to then trek down the rather steep hill to the marina, hoping to avoid the cat on the way back. So the marina was very pleasant, other than the rat-catching evidence in certain places. It was just very tranquil, not a lot to do, and there was no chance of my having lunch in the restaurant there, which only served fish. Unfortunately, being highly allergic to many, but not all forms of fish, all a bit peculiar, it always leaves me with a strong chance of dying on my dinner plate, so it was a no-no to that one. Instead, we headed to the beach area and we had a few drinks in a cafe overlooking the sea. Again, very tranquil and not too hot, with a lovely breeze there. All in all, if you just want to wind down and do something that's not city-based, this is a place to head. As you then return back to Termini, you are then at a great place from which to get to other places like the Pantheon very quickly. We also headed to Piazza Navona. But one thing you're very likely to find in Rome is some disappointment at some part of your journey or other, because you will find that what you wanted to see is covered with scaffolding and sheeting, because restoration work is going on. It just kind of goes with the Roman territory and the fact that these things are so many centuries old and restoration work needs to be carried out. And this was the case with the fountain of the Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi in Piazza Navona, one of the most famous fountains in Rome. I had to settle instead for aubergine parmigiana in the restaurant opposite, which is also called the Quattro Fiumi. So what else can I say about Rome? We did the 135 steps of the Spanish Steps on the last morning, this being made slightly more difficult by the continued closure of Spania tube station. Again, writing about places like the Spanish Steps has made me very aware that this is a big area for pickpocketing. So I refused the offer of a rose on arrival at the top of the steps by the Trinità dei Monti church. It's actually very close to walk from here to other areas like the Trevi, so we did that. Seemingly, it's okay to step in the water of the fountain at the bottom of the Spanish Steps in the Piazza di Spagna, which is known as the Fountain of the Longboat. Well, I think this, given that a member of the Carabinieri was parked up right there and did nothing to stop people or arrest people, although I didn't risk it myself. I'd absolutely forgotten that Keats lived and died in the house on the right at the bottom of the Spanish Steps, but that's the case. Another thing to note about the attractiveness of the Hotel Napoleon for me is that there's also, and this was a real delight for me to discover, a Mondadori bookshop in its arcaded walkway. So I dived in there before we went home and I bought some of my favourite reads in Italian, which are children's books, opting for a couple of Roald Dahls this time. It's not quite as good as an independent libreria, such as the children's bookshop in Bologna, but it was better than the bookshop at Termini, in which I bought nothing. Do check out the shops at Termini, however. The football-themed shop is pretty good, even if the price tags are very high. Getting a taxi back to the airport was thankfully fairly easy, even though we were stopped from progressing up one street because a tram had derailed. I was somewhat bemused when the taxi driver took a picture of the stricken tram and posted it on social media. Having done that, we continued our journey. So what would I say about Rome overall? I think it's perhaps very much a bucket list place. Despite having thrown my coin into the fountain, which is supposed to mean that you'll return, I'm not sure I would, even though my dream is to drive around the whole of Italy one day soon. In a way, there's just too much going on in Rome, just too many beautiful buildings, fountains, and so on. Perhaps I just love Bologna so much because you can just walk the whole of it and breathe in the street musicians playing and the wonderful vibe of the city in one go. I never found that possible in Rome, perhaps because there are just too many tourists and tour groups wherever you go. And it's hard, I guess, to poodle around without piling into the back of a totally static person who's tuned into some audio guide or other, totally oblivious to anyone around them and not willing or aware that they need to budge and let others through. So I did love the Trevi, despite the mass tourism. I was naturally in awe of the Colosseum. All would undoubtedly have been much more pleasant had we had the chance to walk between more places and explore. But in that heat, you just can't do that. It's totally sapping of the energy, and it's also a health risk to do too much in it. Every English person I spoke to said exactly the same thing. So if I did return, it would be in spring or autumn, or maybe even in winter. It's a warning, really, that anywhere in Europe in midsummer is now subjected to these extreme conditions in a world of climate change. So you have to really take a gamble if you decide to head off in July and August. On this basis, I really feel for parents who have to stick to summer holidays. So, having said all of this, and that I might consider a trip to Rome at a different time, would I go back to the Vatican museums ever again? What do you think? Well, here's a definitive statement on that for you. Not in this lifetime. Anyway, I do hope that despite this bit of negativity, you've enjoyed this episode and insight into Rome and the things to note. Until the next time, take good care of yourself, whether you are in Malibu or Monte in Rome itself, or if you are indeed stuck on a 3-year journey through the Vatican museums. I hope that wherever you poodle around, you will do so with true spirit and independence and live life on a different axle.